She worked herself to exhaustion while her boss humiliated her in front of the customers. But he didn't know who was watching him. Subscribe and comment. Where are you watching from? The city was alive before dawn. Towering buildings loomed in the distance, their windows glowing faintly as if waking up from a restless sleep. In the quieter neighborhoods, the streets were lined with small shops and cafes. The scent of fresh bread and morning coffee began to drift into the cool air. Among these was the Morning Roast, a modest cafe tucked between a laundromat and a corner store. From the outside, it looked warm and inviting, with its dim lights and the promise of something comforting within. But for the employees behind the counter, it was a different world, one of exhaustion, relentless work, and the ever-present fear of making a mistake. Celia Lewis had been working at the Morning Roast for almost 4 years, ever since she had been forced to drop out of college. Life had taken unexpected turns, and she had adapted, as she always did. She was 28 years old, a mother to a bright-eyed 5-year-old boy, and, most recently, pregnant again. The news had come as a shock, leaving her feeling both terrified and guilty. Raising Malcolm on her own was already difficult, and now she had another child on the way. The father was no longer in the picture, not that he had ever truly been present. And then there was her mother, Viola, whose health had been declining steadily over the past year. Celia had taken on the role of caretaker, making sure her mother had her medication, that she ate, that she had everything she needed, because if she didn't, no one else would. She had no time to dwell on her fears. Her days were packed so tightly that she barely had time to breathe, let alone worry. Each morning, she woke before the sun, preparing breakfast for Malcolm, making sure his backpack was packed for preschool, checking on Viola, giving her medicine, making sure she ate at least a few bites before leaving. The guilt of walking out that door every morning was suffocating, but she had no choice. Bills didn't wait. Rent was due. Medicine was expensive. The cafe was already open when Celia arrived, slipping into the back entrance as she always did, shaking off the cold from her worn-out jacket. The inside of the cafe was bright, the air thick with the smell of brewing coffee and the chatter of early customers. It should have felt cozy, welcoming even, but to Celia, it was just another reminder of the hours ahead. "Late again," came a voice from across the kitchen. She barely flinched. She knew that voice. Jackson Brewer stood by the coffee machines, arms crossed, a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. He was a man in his mid-40s, always dressed in an immaculate button-down shirt and slacks, a sharp contrast to the stained aprons and worn sneakers of his employees. He was the kind of man who took pleasure in reminding people of their place, and, in his eyes, Celia's place was at the very bottom. "I'm not late," Celia said, moving quickly to tie her apron around her waist. "I clocked in on time." Jackson's smirk widened. "You cut it close. Again." She said nothing. There was no point in arguing. "Get to work," he said, his tone dismissive. "The rush is about to start, and I don't want to see you dragging your feet." Celia bit the inside of her cheek and forced herself to keep moving. She didn't have the luxury of snapping back. She couldn't afford to lose this job, not with Malcolm, not with her mother, not with another baby on the way. The morning rush began soon after, a wave of customers pouring in, filling the cafe with noise. Celia worked as fast as she could, taking orders, brewing coffee, running from one end of the counter to the other. The ache in her lower back started early, a dull, throbbing pain that worsened with every passing hour. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. By noon, the cafe was a blur of movement, the heat from the coffee machines and ovens making the air thick and stifling. Celia barely had time to breathe between orders. Her hands were sore, her legs stiff, and yet Jackson found every excuse to hover near her, watching her every move, waiting for a mistake. "You're slow today," he remarked as she wiped down a counter. "I'm doing my best," she said without looking up. Jackson chuckled, shaking his head. "Your best isn't good enough." Celia clenched her jaw and kept scrubbing. By the time her shift was finally over, the exhaustion was bone deep. She peeled off her apron, hung it in the back, and stepped out into the cold air, breathing in deeply. The relief of being out of that place, if only for a few hours, was overwhelming. But she had no time to linger. She caught the bus home, nodding off against the window as the city blurred past. When she finally stepped into her small apartment, she was met with the sound of Malcolm's laughter and the sight of her mother sitting in her chair by the window, wrapped in a blanket. "Mama!" Malcolm ran to her, his small arms wrapping around her legs. She crouched, pulling him into a hug, her heart aching with love and guilt. "Hey, baby." Her mother watched her with tired eyes. "Long day?" Celia forced a smile. The usual. She didn't tell them how badly her feet ached, how her back felt like it was splitting in two. She didn't tell them about Jackson, about the way he humiliated her in front of customers, about how she wanted to quit but couldn't. She simply sat with them, holding Malcolm close, trying to ignore the weight pressing down on her chest. As the night stretched on, she tucked Malcolm into bed, kissed his forehead, and checked on her mother once more. The apartment was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the city outside. Celia sat on the couch, staring at the ceiling, exhaustion making her limbs heavy. She didn't know how much longer she could keep this up. But she had no choice. The alarm buzzed at 5 in the morning, its sharp beeping slicing through the darkness of the apartment. Celia groaned, rubbing her eyes as she forced herself upright. Her body ached from the previous day, her muscles tight, her lower back sore from standing too long at work. She reached over, turning off the alarm before it woke Malcolm. For a moment, she sat on the edge of the bed, trying to gather the strength to start another day. The weight of exhaustion pressed down on her, not just physically, but mentally. There was no time to rest. She had to keep going. She made her way to the kitchen, moving as quietly as possible. The apartment was small, every sound echoing off the thin walls. Her mother was still asleep in the other room, her breathing slow and steady. Celia prepared a quick breakfast, oatmeal for Malcolm, toast and coffee for herself. As she moved, her mind was already ahead of her, thinking about the long shift at the cafe, the bills waiting to be paid, the growing need for more prenatal checkups that she couldn't afford. By the time Malcolm stirred, rubbing his sleepy eyes, she was already dressed for work, her uniform neatly pressed despite the worn-out fabric. She smiled as he stumbled into the kitchen, still half asleep, his curls a messy halo around his head. "Mornin', baby," she said, lifting him into a chair and placing a bowl of oatmeal in front of him. He mumbled something in return, too drowsy to form full words. She sat with him for a moment, drinking her coffee, savoring the brief peace of the early morning before the day swallowed her whole. When it was time to leave, she kissed her mother on the forehead, whispering a quiet goodbye, and led Malcolm outside to wait for the bus. The air was crisp, the streets quiet except for the occasional car passing by. By the time she arrived at the cafe, she already felt drained, but she pushed through it. She had no choice. The moment she stepped inside, Jackson's eyes were on her. "Cutting it close again, Lewis," he said, his voice carrying over the noise of the coffee machines. Celia ignored him, tying her apron around her waist and heading straight for the register. The morning rush was beginning, and she needed to focus. The cafe quickly filled with people, the air growing thick with the scent of espresso and fresh pastries. Customers lined up, placing their orders, chatting amongst themselves, oblivious to the whirlwind of activity behind the counter. Celia worked as fast as she could, taking orders, pouring coffee, balancing trays. Her back throbbed, the ache spreading down to her legs, but she didn't slow down. Jackson, however, was watching. He hovered near her, his sharp eyes scanning her movements, waiting for a mistake. And then it happened. A customer had ordered a caramel latte with oat milk. Celia, moving too quickly, grabbed the wrong carton. It wasn't until she had already handed the cup over that she realized the mistake. The customer took a sip and immediately frowned. "This isn't oat milk," the woman said, her voice edged with irritation. Celia's stomach sank. "I'm so sorry." Before she could finish, Jackson was already beside her. "Are you kidding me?" he said, loud enough for the entire cafe to hear. Celia's face burned. Customers turned to watch. Her coworkers froze. "It's not a big deal. I can remake it," she started, but Jackson cut her off. "It is a big deal," he snapped. "How many times do I have to tell you to double-check the orders? This is basic stuff, Lewis." The customer shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting such a reaction. Celia could feel the heat creeping up her neck, the shame settling deep in her stomach. "I'll fix it," she said quietly. But Jackson wasn't done. "You're always sorry," he muttered. "Maybe, if you actually paid attention, you wouldn't screw up so much." The words hit harder than she expected. She knew what he was doing. He wanted to make an example of her, to show everyone that he was in charge, that she was beneath him. She gritted her teeth, forcing herself to stay calm as she remade the drink. The customer gave her a sympathetic look before taking the new cup and walking away. Celia wanted to disappear. The rest of the shift was just as brutal. Jackson continued to find reasons to criticize her. He nitpicked everything. Her pace, the way she stacked the cups, the slight wrinkle in her uniform. He made comments about her pregnancy, about how it was slowing her down, about how maybe she should consider finding a job more suited to her condition. By midday, Celia was exhausted, her body aching from standing too long without a break. The cafe was still packed, the line of customers never ending. She moved on autopilot, forcing herself to keep going, one order at a time. Then, another mistake. A tray slipped from her hands, crashing onto the counter. A cup of hot coffee tipped over, spilling onto the floor. Jackson was there in an instant. "Unbelievable," he said, shaking his head. "Do you even know what you're doing anymore?" Celia's throat tightened. "It was an accident," she said. Jackson scoffed. "Accident? More like incompetence." A few customers glanced over, sensing the tension. Celia wanted to fight back, to say something, but the words caught in her throat. "Clean it up," Jackson ordered, stepping back with a look of disgust. Celia grabbed a towel, kneeling down to wipe up the mess. Her hands shook, her vision blurred. She took a slow breath, trying to keep herself together. She felt small, powerless. By the time the cafe finally started to slow down, she could barely stand. The weight of the day pressed down on her, the humiliation sinking deep into her bones. She wanted to quit. She wanted to walk out and never come back. But she couldn't. She had a son. She had a mother who depended on her. So she kept her head down, finishing her shift in silence. As she clocked out, she avoided Jackson's gaze, stepping out into the cold air. The sky was beginning to darken, the city lights flickering on one by one. She stood outside the cafe for a moment, taking slow, deep breaths. She didn't notice the man sitting in the corner of the cafe, watching everything. She didn't see the way he had observed each interaction, the way his expression had darkened every time Jackson spoke to her. She didn't know that someone had been paying attention, someone who wasn't going to let this continue. The next morning arrived too soon, bringing with it the same heavy exhaustion Celia had been carrying for years. Her body ached, her back protested as she pushed herself out of bed, and for a brief moment, she let herself imagine what it would be like to just stop, to sleep in, to let someone else shoulder the burden for once. But reality was relentless, and so she forced herself upright, knowing that another long day at the cafe awaited. Malcolm was still asleep when she shuffled into the kitchen. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of the city waking up outside. She moved through the morning motions like a ghost, preparing a simple breakfast, laying out Malcolm's clothes for preschool, checking on her mother, making sure her medication was within reach. When Malcolm finally emerged from his room, rubbing his eyes, she mustered up a smile for him. He was the reason she kept going, the reason she swallowed her exhaustion and ignored the pain. "Morning, baby," she said softly, running a hand through his curls. He mumbled something in return, his voice still thick with sleep, and crawled into the chair at the kitchen table. Celia placed a plate of toast in front of him and sat down across from him, sipping her coffee in silence. She didn't want to think about the cafe. She didn't want to think about Jackson and the way he had humiliated her in front of customers the day before. But she could still hear his voice, sharp and demeaning, echoing in her mind. When it was time to leave, she helped Malcolm put on his shoes, kissed her mother goodbye, and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The bus ride to work was the same as always, crowded, slow, filled with the murmur of tired workers heading to their own long days. She stared out the window, letting the motion of the bus lull her into a daze, until her stop came into view. As she stepped into the cafe, the familiar scent of coffee and pastries greeted her, but there was no comfort in it. Jackson was already there, standing near the counter, his usual smug expression in place. He didn't say anything as she clocked in, but the look he gave her was enough. She braced herself for another difficult day. The morning rush began quickly, customers filling the space, their conversations overlapping in a dull hum. Celia worked through the orders methodically, forcing herself to focus on the tasks at hand rather than the ache in her feet or the way her uniform felt too tight around her growing stomach. She didn't have time to think about how tired she was. She didn't have time to feel anything at all. It wasn't until mid-morning, when the rush had begun to slow, that she noticed him. A man sat alone at a corner table, his posture relaxed, his eyes scanning the cafe with quiet observation. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, dressed simply in a dark sweater and slacks. His hair was mostly gray, neatly trimmed, and there was something about the way he held himself that suggested authority. He wasn't a regular. Celia had never seen him before, but there was something about him that unsettled her. Not in a bad way, but in a way that made her feel as though he saw too much. She tried to shake the feeling and focused on cleaning up the counter, wiping away stray coffee grounds and crumbs. But every time she glanced toward the corner of the cafe, the man was still there, sipping his coffee, watching. Not in a rude or obvious way, but with a quiet attentiveness that made her uneasy. Jackson, of course, hadn't noticed. He was too busy finding ways to make her life miserable. "You're moving slow again," he muttered as he passed by. Pick it up, Lewis." Celia clenched her jaw but didn't respond. She had learned long ago that arguing with him only made things worse. Another wave of customers entered, and she forced herself to focus on their orders, on the motion of pouring coffee, on the rhythm of her own breathing. She wouldn't let him get to her today. She couldn't afford to. But the man in the corner remained. He stayed longer than most customers, ordering a second cup of coffee, occasionally glancing around the cafe as if he were taking mental notes. Celia caught his gaze once, and for a brief second, she thought he might say something, but he only offered a small, almost imperceptible nod before returning his attention to his drink. She didn't have time to dwell on it. By the time her lunch break came, she felt like she had already been working for an eternity. She stepped into the back, leaning against the wall, closing her eyes for just a moment. Her feet throbbed, her back ached, and the thought of enduring several more hours of this felt unbearable. She barely had a chance to sit before Jackson appeared in the doorway. "Break's over," he said, not even bothering to check the clock. She looked up, exhaustion weighing down her limbs. "I just sat down." Jackson smirked. "Then you should have moved faster." Celia bit back a sharp retort and forced herself to stand, ignoring the way her legs protested. She moved past him without another word, stepping back onto the floor, back into the noise, back into the endless cycle of exhaustion. The man in the corner was still there. She noticed him again as she cleaned a table near the window, the quiet intensity of his gaze. She tried not to let it distract her, but it was difficult. Something about him was different from the usual customers, from the businessmen tapping away at their laptops, from the groups of friends chatting over pastries. He wasn't there for the coffee. He was watching, and Celia didn't know why. As the afternoon wore on, he finally finished his drink, stood, and made his way to the counter. Celia braced herself, unsure of what to expect. But instead of ordering another coffee or making small talk, he simply handed her a generous tip and said, "Thank you." His voice was even, calm, not unkind. She barely had time to respond before he turned and walked out the door, disappearing into the busy street outside. Celia stood there for a moment, frowning. She didn't know who he was, but something told her this wouldn't be the last time she saw him. The next morning felt heavier than usual, as though the weight of exhaustion had settled deeper into Celia's bones overnight. She moved through her apartment like a shadow, performing the same routine she had done for years. The quiet hum of the city waking up outside mixed with the sound of Malcolm's soft breathing as he slept. For a fleeting moment, she let herself linger by his bedside, brushing a curl from his forehead. He was so peaceful, so unaware of the storm that constantly raged in her life. She wished she could give him more time, more stability, more of everything he deserved. By the time she stepped into the cafe, the morning rush had already begun. The air was thick with the scent of espresso, the sound of chatter blending with the mechanical whir of the coffee machines. She barely had time to clock in before Jackson's voice cut through the noise. "Pick up the pace, Lewis. You were slow yesterday, and I don't need a repeat performance." Celia gritted her teeth and nodded, moving behind the counter. She wasn't in the mood to fight today. She never was, but today especially. Her body felt sluggish, weighed down by the constant ache in her lower back and the dull headache forming behind her eyes. She ignored it, the way she ignored everything else. The morning hours passed in a blur of orders and motion. She worked on autopilot, pouring coffee, preparing pastries, wiping down tables when she had a spare second. She felt the stares of customers, the impatience when she wasn't fast enough, The way people barely looked at her when they snatched their drinks from the counter. She was used to it, used to feeling invisible, used to existing only to serve. But there was one person who saw her. The man from yesterday was back. He sat in the same corner, dressed much the same way. Dark sweater, neutral expression, his eyes carefully observing the cafe as if he were studying it. He ordered coffee again, black, and sipped it slowly as though he had nowhere else to be. Celia tried not to let it bother her, but she felt his presence more than she did the dozens of other customers in the cafe. She didn't know what he wanted, but she knew instinctively that he wasn't just another customer. She didn't have time to dwell on it. Jackson was in one of his moods. It started small, the way it always did. First, it was a sharp comment about the way she arranged the cups on the counter. Then, it was the way she wasn't moving fast enough. "You look half asleep, Louis," he muttered under his breath as she passed him. "Maybe you should have gotten to bed earlier instead of—" She didn't hear the rest. She didn't want to. She focused on the orders, on getting through the next few hours. But Jackson wasn't done with her. When a customer complained that their drink was slightly too sweet, he seized the opportunity. "Seriously, Louis?" He grabbed the cup from the counter and held it up for everyone to see. "You can't even get a basic order right?" Celia froze. Customers turned to watch. The cafe went quiet, the way it always did when Jackson found a new reason to humiliate her. "I can remake it," she said, her voice steady but quiet. Jackson scoffed. "Yeah, you will. But maybe this time actually pay attention. Or is that too much to ask?" She swallowed the anger, the shame. A flicker of movement caught her eye. The man in the corner had lowered his cup, watching the scene unfold. His face remained neutral, unreadable, but his attention was fully on them. Celia turned away, gripping the edge of the counter for a moment before remaking the drink with careful, steady hands. The rest of the shift was a slow, torturous descent. Jackson continued to nitpick, his comments becoming sharper, crueler. It was as if he could sense that she was nearing her limit and wanted to push her over the edge. Then, the final straw. Celia had been moving quickly, trying to keep up with the rush. She'd just poured a fresh cup of coffee when someone called her name, distracting her for a second too long. Her grip slipped. The cup tumbled forward, splashing coffee onto the counter. The cafe went silent. Jackson's footsteps were slow and deliberate as he approached. Celia already knew what was coming. "You are absolutely useless," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Maybe, if you weren't so distracted with your mess of a life, you wouldn't screw up every 5 minutes." Something inside her cracked. Her breath hitched, her fingers tightening around the towel she was holding. She had taken his cruelty for so long, swallowed it down, forced herself to keep going no matter how much he tried to break her. But today she couldn't. Her hands trembled as she wiped up the mess, her vision blurring as hot tears threatened to spill. She wouldn't let them. Not here, not in front of him. She straightened up and met his gaze, something steely settling inside her. "You don't get to talk to me like that," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Jackson's eyes darkened. A slow smirk curled on his lips as if he had been waiting for this moment. "Oh, really?" he said, stepping closer. "And what are you going to do about it?" Celia didn't have an answer. She didn't have the luxury of quitting. She didn't have the power to fight back. She had Malcolm. She had a baby on the way. She had a sick mother waiting for her at home. Jackson knew that, and that's why he knew she wouldn't do anything. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You're nothing," he said. And you always will be." Celia felt her hands clench at her sides. She felt the sting of his words settle deep, cutting into places she had spent years trying to protect. She turned away. The shift ended not long after, but she barely remembered the last few hours. She moved through them in a haze, her body functioning on autopilot, her mind elsewhere. By the time she stepped outside, the air felt suffocating. She needed to breathe, but her chest was too tight, her throat too constricted. She stood on the sidewalk, staring at the street, trying to hold herself together. She didn't hear the footsteps behind her at first. When she turned, the man from the corner table was standing there, watching her. For the first time, he spoke. "I saw what happened in there." His voice was calm, steady, not unkind. Celia stared at him, her heart still hammering from the encounter with Jackson. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know what he wanted. But somehow she knew. This wasn't the end of it. Celia stood frozen on the sidewalk, her body still tense from the humiliation she had endured moments ago. The cafe door had swung shut behind her, but she could still hear the muffled chatter of customers inside, oblivious to what had just transpired. The cold air nipped at her skin, but she barely felt it. Her mind was still trapped in that moment, in Jackson's sneering voice, in the heat of embarrassment that had flushed through her body. The man in front of her? Him. The one who had been sitting in the corner of the cafe all morning, watching. Now he was here, standing before her, his gaze calm and unreadable. His presence unsettled her, not because he had done anything to intimidate her, but because he had been a silent observer to her worst moment. She didn't know what to say. "I saw what happened in there," he repeated, his voice even, but laced with something firm beneath the calm. Celia swallowed, gripping her arms as if holding herself together. "It's fine," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "It happens all the time." His expression didn't change. If anything, his jaw tightened slightly, as if her words had confirmed something he had already suspected. He studied her for a long moment, and Celia suddenly felt exposed in a way she hadn't before. This wasn't the usual judgment she faced from customers, the disapproving glances or impatient sighs when she wasn't fast enough. This man was looking at her like he saw everything. Her exhaustion, her frustration, the quiet, desperate endurance she had been clinging to for years. She hated it. "I need to get home," she said, shifting awkwardly. He nodded, as if sensing she didn't want to talk. "I understand." For a second, she thought that was the end of it, that he would walk away like any other stranger. But instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a card, extending it toward her. "Take this," he said. Celia hesitated before accepting it. She glanced down, expecting a name, a company logo, something that would tell her who he was. But the card was plain, only a number printed neatly across the front. No name, no title, just a phone number. "If anything like that happens again, call me." She looked up at him, frowning. "Why would I do that?" His lips pressed into a thin line. "Because no one should be treated the way you were." Celia almost laughed. Almost. It was a nice sentiment, but it meant nothing. People like him, well-dressed, confident, standing tall as if the world bent around them, didn't understand how things worked for people like her. There was no safety net. There was no one to call. Still, she nodded, tucking the card into her pocket. Not because she intended to use it, but because she didn't have the energy to argue. He gave her one last look, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the city crowd. Celia exhaled, her breath visible in the cold air. She didn't know what had just happened, but she didn't have time to dwell on it. She had to get home. By the time she stepped into her apartment, she was barely holding herself together. Malcolm ran to greet her, his little arms wrapping around her legs, his warmth grounding her for a moment. She forced herself to smile, running a hand over his curls. Her mother was awake, sitting in her usual chair by the window. She gave Celia a knowing look, one that said she could tell something had happened, but she didn't ask. She never did. Celia was grateful for that. The night passed in a blur. She helped Malcolm with his bedtime routine, checked her mother's medication, reheated leftovers for herself even though she barely had an appetite. She thought about the man, about the card in her pocket, about Jackson and his words. "You're nothing." She clenched her hands into fists, pushing the thought away. The next morning was no different from any other. The alarm dragged her from sleep, and she forced herself to start another day. Malcolm's sleepy voice was the only thing that gave her the strength to move. When she arrived at the cafe, Jackson was waiting. "Try not to embarrass yourself today," he said as she walked in. Celia said nothing. She tied her apron and got to work. The morning rush was the same as always. Customers lining up, orders piling in, her body moving faster than it should have to keep up. Jackson hovered nearby, waiting for her to mess up. And then, at the peak of the rush, the cafe door opened, and a familiar figure walked in. Celia froze. It was him, the man from yesterday. But this time, there was no mystery. Because this time, the second he stepped inside, the entire room shifted. Employees straightened, customers paused. Even Jackson, who had been in the middle of berating a barista for getting an order wrong, stiffened. Recognition flickered across Jackson's face, followed by something Celia had never seen before: fear. The man walked to the counter, his expression unreadable, and rested his hands against the smooth surface. His gaze flicked to Jackson. "I'd like to speak with the manager," he said, his voice carrying through the cafe. The silence that followed was suffocating. Celia didn't move. No one did. Jackson swallowed, his face paling slightly. I'm the manager." The man nodded. "Good." He pulled something from his coat and placed it on the counter. A company ID, a company logo, the Morning Roast Corporate, CEO. The blood drained from Jackson's face. Celia's breath caught. She had spent years working in this cafe, never knowing who owned it. She had never seen a corporate executive step foot in this place, and never imagined they would care about what went on in one of their smaller locations. And yet, here he was. "I've been visiting locations personally," the man continued, his tone smooth but firm, "seeing how things are run, seeing how employees are treated." He let those words hang in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Jackson looked like he wanted to disappear. "I saw how you spoke to your employees," the man said, his gaze never wavering. "I saw how you treated them, and I have to say—" He tilted his head slightly, as if considering his next words. "I'm not impressed." Jackson opened his mouth, then shut it. "I don't tolerate mistreatment of employees in any of my establishments," the CEO continued. "So, as of this moment, you're no longer employed here." The cafe was dead silent. Jackson sputtered, his confidence cracking. You can't just—" "I can," the man said smoothly. "And I have." Jackson looked around, as if expecting someone to step in, to protest, but no one did. Employees watched in stunned silence. Customers sat frozen, some barely hiding their satisfaction. For once, Jackson had no power. The CEO gestured toward the door. "You can leave now." Jackson's hands clenched at his sides. He opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. Then, with one last glare at Celia, he turned and stormed out of the cafe. As the door slammed shut behind him, the tension in the room shattered. A few customers whispered amongst themselves. A couple of employees exchanged glances, disbelief clear on their faces. Celia couldn't move. The CEO turned to her. His expression softened slightly. "I owe you an apology," he said. She blinked. "For what?" "For letting this go unnoticed for so long." She didn't know what to say. He nodded toward the back. "When you have a moment, we need to talk." And just like that, everything changed. Celia could hardly believe what she had just witnessed. The cafe, once filled with the constant hum of voices and the clatter of cups, was eerily silent in the wake of Jackson's departure. It felt unreal. For years, she had endured his abuse, the cut-in remarks, the constant weight of his authority pressing down on her like an unshakable force. And now, with just a few words, he was gone. She stood frozen behind the counter, her hands still gripping the rag she had been using to wipe up a spill, though she had long forgotten about the mess. The weight of the moment settled over her in waves. A part of her expected Jackson to come storming back in, to snap at her, to remind her that nothing ever truly changed for people like her. But the door remained closed. Slowly, the atmosphere in the cafe began to shift. Conversations started again, hushed at first, then growing bolder as people processed what had just happened. A couple of regulars exchanged knowing glances, their expressions unreadable. The employees, her co-workers who had, for so long, either avoided Jackson's wrath or suffered under it with her, were still stunned, some looking almost unsure of what to do with themselves. And then, to Celia's complete shock, someone started clapping. It was soft at first, hesitant, as if the person wasn't sure whether it was appropriate. Then another person joined in, and another. Before she knew it, the entire cafe had erupted into quiet applause. A few customers nodded at her, offering small smiles of encouragement, as if they had been waiting for this moment just as much as she had. Celia felt her throat tighten. She turned toward the man who had orchestrated it all, the CEO, the man who had been watching for days, quietly gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment. He stood calmly by the counter, his presence still commanding the room even in the aftermath of what had just occurred. "Let's talk," he said again, his voice gentler now. Celia swallowed and nodded, untying her apron with stiff fingers before stepping out from behind the counter. The other employees didn't move to stop her, and she could feel their eyes on her as she followed the man toward the back of the cafe. They entered the small manager's office, a room she had spent more time in than she cared to remember, though usually for lectures or thinly veiled threats from Jackson. Now it felt different. The CEO took a seat in the chair behind the desk, as if he had every right to be there. He probably did. Celia hesitated for a moment before sitting in the chair across from him, her heart still pounding. "I should start by introducing myself properly," he said, offering a small, almost apologetic smile. "Daniel Carter." The name rang a bell. She had heard it before, though she had never thought much about the corporate side of the morning roast. She had never imagined that someone so high up in the company would ever set foot in a place like this, let alone personally intervene in the way he had. Celia nodded slowly. "You—" She hesitated, then tried again. "You own this place?" He inclined his head slightly. "I do. Or rather, I own the entire chain. But I like to be involved in what happens in my businesses, especially when I hear about problems like the ones happening here." She frowned. "You heard about Jackson?" "I had suspicions," Daniel admitted, his gaze steady. "I get reports about employee turnover, customer complaints, things like that. Your location stood out. Too many people quitting, too many issues that weren't being addressed. But I needed to see it for myself." Celia let that sink in. For years, she had assumed that no one cared, that people like Jackson got away with everything because there was no one to hold them accountable. But now, sitting in front of the man who had fired him without hesitation, she wasn't sure what to think. "Why now?" she asked, her voice quieter. "Why not sooner?" Daniel exhaled, leaning back slightly in the chair. "Because sometimes it takes longer than it should to see what's happening. And for that, I'm sorry." She wasn't sure what to say to that. For so long, she had accepted the way things were. She had convinced herself that she just had to endure, that there was no other option. But now, with Jackson gone, the entire structure of her world felt suddenly unstable, as if she had been standing on a crumbling foundation without realizing it. "What happens now?" she asked finally. Daniel studied her for a moment before replying. "That depends." Celia frowned. "On what?" "On you," he said simply. That caught her off guard. She had spent so much of her life having decisions made for her, by circumstance, by necessity, by people like Jackson who had taken pleasure in making sure she knew her place. The idea that she suddenly had a say in what happened next felt foreign. "I don't understand," she admitted. Daniel folded his hands together. "I'm not just here to remove a bad manager. I'm here to fix the culture of this place, to make sure that the people working here aren't suffering under someone like Jackson again. That means changes, real ones." Celia listened, waiting. "I want you to step up," he said finally, "as manager." The words hit her like a physical force. She blinked. "What?" "You know this cafe better than anyone," Daniel continued. "You know the staff, the customers, the way things actually work. And from what I saw, you've been running this place for years without the title." Celia shook her head automatically. I can't." "You can," Daniel said, his tone unwavering. "And I'll make sure you have the support you need." Her thoughts raced. Manager. The very idea of it was overwhelming. She had spent so long just trying to survive, trying to make it through each day without collapsing under the weight of exhaustion. She had never once considered the possibility of anything more. "I don't know if I'm qualified," she admitted. Daniel's expression softened slightly. "I think you are." Celia let out a slow breath. The idea of taking Jackson's position was daunting, but at the same time, the thought of someone else coming in, someone who might not care, who might make things just as bad, was even worse. She thought of Malcolm, of her mother, of the baby growing inside her. A manager's salary would change everything. "I don't have to decide right now, do I?" she asked hesitantly. Daniel shook his head. "Take the weekend. Think about it. We'll talk again on Monday." Celia nodded slowly. It still felt surreal, like she was in some strange dream she would wake up from any second. But for the first time in a long time, something inside her felt lighter. Daniel stood, signaling the conversation was over for now. As Celia rose to her feet, he extended his hand. She hesitated for only a second before shaking it. As she walked out of the office, the weight of Jackson's absence settled over her in a different way. For the first time since she had started working at the morning roast, she felt something unfamiliar. Hope. Celia walked home that evening feeling like the ground beneath her feet had shifted. The streets of the city were the same as always, cars honking, people rushing, the neon glow of shop signs reflecting on wet pavement. But for the first time in years, she felt as though she were moving through a world where something had changed, something she hadn't yet figured out how to name. Jackson was gone. The words felt strange even inside her own head. She had spent so long enduring his constant presence, his insults, his watchful eye, waiting for her to stumble so he could remind her how easily she could lose everything. And now he was just gone. But that wasn't even the biggest change. Celia had been offered his position. The thought sent a wave of doubt crashing over her. She had never imagined herself in a position of authority, never considered that she could be anything more than what she had always been, a worker struggling to get by. She had spent her whole life trying to keep her head above water, never daring to think about what it would mean to actually swim. She turned the corner onto her street, her apartment building coming into view. The lights in the window told her mother was still awake. The moment she stepped inside, the scent of something warm filled the air. Viola must have made soup, though Celia knew she had barely been eating lately. Malcolm ran to her the second she closed the door. His little arms wrapped around her legs, and she bent down, gathering him into her arms, pressing a kiss into his curls. He giggled, his small hands gripping her tightly, and for a moment, everything else faded. "Mommy, guess what?" he said, his voice bright with excitement. "What, baby?" "I made a new picture at school. It's you and me and Grandma and—" He pulled away, digging into his backpack with dramatic urgency before producing a crumpled sheet of paper covered in colorful scribbles. Celia smiled as she smoothed it out, her heart warming at the sight of herself, Malcolm, and her mother drawn in thick, childlike lines. And at the very bottom, with uneven letters, was one more figure. "Who's this?" she asked gently. Malcolm beamed. "The baby." Celia felt her throat tighten. She blinked rapidly, forcing the sudden sting of tears away. Her mother was watching her from the chair by the window, silent but observant. Celia knew she had questions, but she wouldn't ask. Not yet. Viola had always been that way, letting Celia come to her in her own time. They ate together, or at least Celia tried to. The weight of the day sat heavy in her chest, pressing against her ribs, making each bite harder to swallow. She barely noticed her mother's knowing gaze until she finally spoke. "What happened today?" Celia hesitated, running her fingers along the edge of Malcolm's drawing. For a moment, she considered not saying anything at all, but this wasn't something she could keep inside. She took a breath. "They fired Jackson." Viola's brow lifted slightly, but she said nothing, waiting for Celia to continue. "The owner, Daniel Carter, he was there. He saw everything, how Jackson treated people. He fired him on the spot." A slow nod. "And?" Celia hesitated again. The next part felt even harder to say aloud, as if speaking it would make it real. "He offered me Jackson's job." That caught Viola's full attention. She straightened slightly, her usually tired eyes sharpening with something Celia couldn't quite place. "Well," she said after a moment, "that's unexpected." Celia let out a breath, pressing a hand to her forehead. "I don't know what to do." Viola was silent for a long moment, then finally said, "What's stopping you?" "Everything," Celia wanted to say. She wasn't a manager. She wasn't someone who made decisions, who led a team, who had authority over anything. She was just Celia, a single mother, a woman barely keeping herself together. How could she possibly take on more? "What if I fail?" she whispered. Viola sighed softly. "What if you don't?" Celia shook her head. "It's not that simple." Her mother leaned forward slightly. "It never is. But when has that ever stopped you before?" Celia didn't have an answer for that. She barely slept that night. Her mind wouldn't stop racing, going in circles around the same fears, the same doubts. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined herself standing behind the counter, not as an employee, but as the person in charge. It felt impossible. And yet, another voice whispered, "What if you can?" The next morning, she arrived at the cafe feeling different. The employees looked at her in a way they never had before, not with pity, not with shared frustration, but with something else. Expectation. She wasn't sure if she liked it. Daniel was already waiting in the office when she knocked lightly on the door. He looked up from his laptop and gestured for her to come in. "Morning," he said, his voice calm as always. Celia sat down, feeling awkward in the chair across from him. She still didn't know how to act around him. He had been a customer just days ago, a stranger watching from the corner. Now he was her potential boss. "Have you thought about my offer?" he asked. Celia nodded slowly. "I have." Daniel leaned back slightly. "And?" She exhaled, staring down at her hands. The words felt heavy in her mouth, but when she finally spoke them, they felt right. "I want to try." Something in Daniel's expression shifted. Not surprise, but approval, as if he had known what her answer would be before she even said it. "Good," he said. "I think you'll do well." Celia wasn't sure if she believed that. They spent the next hour going over what the position would actually entail. The responsibilities, the expectations, the transition process. Daniel assured her that she wouldn't be alone. He would make sure she had proper training, that she had a support system, that she wasn't thrown into the deep end with no help. It all sounded so foreign to her. She wasn't used to people offering help. By the time the meeting ended, Celia felt overwhelmed, but there was something else underneath the fear. Hope. She stepped out of the office and back into the cafe. Her cafe now, in a way she had never imagined before. The employees looked at her with curiosity, and for the first time she met their eyes without looking away. She wasn't sure what kind of manager she would be. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but she was willing to try. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The first few weeks as manager were the hardest. Celia had thought she understood the cafe, that after years of working behind the counter, she knew every inch of it, every challenge, every unspoken rule. But stepping into the role Jackson had once held was like seeing it from a new angle, one that revealed just how much she had never been allowed to see. At first, everything felt overwhelming. She had to learn scheduling, inventory management, payroll, handling customer complaints, not as an employee taking the blame, but as the person responsible for finding solutions. The first time she had to discipline an employee for repeatedly showing up late, she felt like an imposter, as if any moment someone would step in and remind her she didn't belong in this position. But no one did. Daniel had kept his word. He checked in regularly, sometimes visiting in person, sometimes through emails or calls. He never hovered, never made her feel like she was being watched, but he was always there if she needed guidance. And more than once, she did. She had expected resistance from the staff, especially from those who had worked under Jackson for years, but to her surprise, most of them welcomed the change. Some even approached her privately, saying they were relieved to have a manager who actually listened. That realization settled deep in her chest. She had spent so long believing she had no control over anything in her life, but here she could make things better. It wasn't easy. She worked longer hours than ever, often staying late to catch up on paperwork or reorganize the chaotic systems Jackson had left behind. But there was a difference now. She wasn't just surviving. She was building something. One evening, after a particularly long shift, she arrived home to find Malcolm waiting for her with a grin. He held up another drawing, this one featuring her standing behind the cafe counter, a bright yellow crown drawn on her head. "You're the boss now," he said proudly. Celia laughed, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in a long time. "I guess I am." Her mother, watching from her chair by the window, gave her a small, knowing smile. "You're still getting used to it," she said. Celia nodded. "It doesn't feel real yet." Viola sipped her tea. "It will." The weeks passed, and slowly the weight of doubt began to lift. Customers started to recognize her not just as the woman behind the counter, but as the one running things. She made changes, small ones at first, then bigger ones. She adjusted the schedule to make sure employees weren't overworked, introduced better training for new hires, even convinced corporate to approve minor renovations to the cafe's outdated equipment. One day, Daniel came by unannounced. He sat at his usual corner table, watching, just like he had before. But this time, when their eyes met, there was no mystery, no uncertainty. He simply nodded in approval. Later, as she was closing up for the night, he stayed behind, waiting for her. "You're doing well," he said as she locked the door. Celia let out a breath, leaning against the counter. "Some days I feel like I know what I'm doing. Other days," she shook her head, "it still feels like I'm figuring it out as I go." Daniel smiled slightly. "That's how leadership works." She considered that. "Did you feel like that when you started?" A shadow crossed his face, something quieter, more reflective. "Yes," he admitted, "especially after my wife passed." Celia blinked, surprised by the admission. He had always seemed so composed, so sure of himself. "I was a single father," he continued. "My daughter was still a baby when it happened. And suddenly, I was responsible for this company, for raising a child, for keeping everything from falling apart." He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "I didn't know if I could do it, but I didn't have a choice." Celia stared at him, something settling in her chest. She had never expected to find common ground with someone like him, but now she understood. "You know what that's like," he said, as if reading her thoughts, "carrying everything on your shoulders, wondering if you're doing enough." She nodded slowly. Daniel leaned against the counter. "That's why I offered you the job." Celia frowned slightly. "Because I remind you of yourself?" He smiled faintly. "Because I saw your strength before you did." Celia swallowed. The words hit deeper than she expected. For so long, she had been told what she wasn't. Not good enough, not smart enough, not worth more than a minimum wage paycheck. And now, someone had seen her, truly seen her, and told her she was more. She wasn't sure how to respond to that, so instead she said, "Thank you." Daniel nodded as if that was enough. "You've earned it." As he turned to leave, Celia looked around the cafe, the place that had once felt like a cage, a never-ending cycle of exhaustion. Now it was something else, something she had built. She still had doubts. She still had fears. But for the first time in a long time, she also had something else, a future. And for now, that was enough. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out other videos on the channel for more and share this video with someone who might like it too.